So I have to learn how to talk and operate the technology at the same time. This is a challenge, okay? But before I do that, I wanted to say this is an incredible honor to be here. Krakow, for me, has always been one of the centers of Europe. I do not think Europe has center in Paris or Berlin or London. I always thought that the center of Europe is somewhere between East and West. And Krakow has this incredibly old university. I mean, it's one of the oldest universities in the world. Furthermore, I just learned she gave up her jewelry, okay? So university professors and students rely on benefactors. And you had a very important benefactor very early on. She only lived until she was 25, I think, 1499, okay? But was buried, Tomasz just told me, with wooden bracelets or things, okay? So this is a great honor to be here, to think not about Poland, but to think about Europe. At the same time that Krakow is very old, I must say you party very hard. I mean, it is an incredibly young city. When you walk around downtown at 11 or midnight, which I have, life is just pouring out of all bars and places, okay? This combination between being so old and being so young is really very special. And thank you for the invitation. So now let me see. See, I messed up already. Good. So this is about recent American foreign policy, but because what's recent is not well interpreted from the perspective of today. Schopenhauer always said that journalists are the second hands of history. They always tell the wrong time. I will try to put Trump into the broader American tradition. I know there's some people here in American studies to show you that he is not unique. He's distinctive. He's not unique. There are many strands of American history pointing to this kind of tradition. And I will conclude that America is not made out of one tradition or two, but out of several. And that the history of American foreign policy is one of the recombination of different traditions. And that lesson is, I think, a lesson for any country. When people talk about China does this and America does that, never forget that's a shorthand. China is a very big place, so is America. It's made out of multiple traditions, and it's the role of politicians to create new combinations of old traditions to solve the problems of their times. This is true of Poland, it's true of Liechtenstein and Monaco. That is, the essentializing of actors into one unit is a shorthand, and we do great disservice to ourselves when we think that the shorthand is accurately depicting the politics. Trump is not America. America is much bigger and greater than Trump, but he is clearly part of America. And for people who are saying he's not part of America, I say, wake up. He is part of our own. So, democracy in action. I was not surprised by the election outcome. I live in upstate New York, halfway between Toronto and New York City. It's called the Finger Lakes region, beautiful part of the country, but dirt poor. Has been dirt poor for decades. Didn't matter whether Democrats were running Washington or Republicans, the people in upstate New York got shafted. So I still remember a bet which I made with the Board of Trustees of Cornell University, then working, actually he was the director of the the Clinton Foundation, and this was in January of 2016, well before Trump had won the primaries. And he said, well, if Trump should become the candidate, it will be an easy victory for Hillary. And I said, no way, it will be a very closely contested election. And he said, let's bet. And I said, sure, but you are very rich, I'm just a professor. I buy you a very good bottle of wine. If you win, you buy me a case of that same bottle, okay? And I've not collected. I didn't have the guts to go to him and saying, you owe me a case of really good wine, because he's out of a job, okay? So, but living in upstate New York, I didn't predict Trump's election. All I knew, it was going to be a very close election, and there would be the dynamics of the election which would decide the outcome, which is exactly what happened, okay? But what happened in 2016 happened in 2008. that is a new part of the country was mobilized politically. The electorate was enlarged by Obama, who created a new kind of coalition of people in the Democratic Party and other parts of American society who hadn't voted before. They had been shut out for decades. In 2010, there was a groundswell of opposition on the right called the Tea Party. It mobilized people into politics who had never been part of politics, and a determined opposition to the Obama election and the Democratic program. And that Tea Party election was the precursor to the Trump campaign. And if you looked at the Trump primary elections, you know, there were 18 candidates. Everybody always said Trump can never win. What he achieved was an enormous increase in the electorate in the Republican primaries. People came, hundreds of thousands and millions of people voted in the primaries, which he pointed out to all these journalists and said, this has never happened before. They were independents, they were non-voters, they were Democrats. We said, for once, here's a guy who's different from all the other politicians. We're going to vote for him. And this you could see during the primary election. So the fact that all the pundits were wrong and the statistical models were wrong was based on an enormous amount of closing of your eyes. And it was a triumph of democracy that Trump got elected, just as it was a triumph of democracy that Obama got elected. I remember traveling in East Asia in particular in 2007, and they asked about Obama. I said, he has a pretty good chance. And they said, no way. And I said, why? Because you're racists. I said, yeah, Americans are racist, and they're non-racist also. And I went back in 2009 and said, so what about that Obama election? And they just scratched their heads. From which I have relearned the lesson that the regenerative capacity of American society is much greater than anybody abroad ever thinks. So I never bet American society. I may bet American politics, but never against the American society. So here you see Trump slaying the Republican Party. The old Republican Party is dead. You see the remnants of that party climbing on board like rats climbing onto the ship, okay, trying to get the spoils of victory. So whatever happens after Trump, the party system is changing. It looks like there's a Democratic Party. No way. There are two Democratic parties, or three. They're held together right now by opposition to Trump. They're deeply divided. The American party system is in profound transition to something new and different, and nobody knows what's going to come. So, unpredictability caused by polarization. When I came to America in the 1960s, I remember my first course in political science, it was Weimar democracy as opposed to American democracy. Weimar was divided between communists and fascists and was broken by the opposition between those two extremes. American democracy was centrist. European politics, not just German politics, European politics has turned centrist in the last 50 years. American politics has polarized. And the polarization is quite deep. That is, in this election, the two candidates were the most disliked candidates we have ever had the privilege of voting for, both Clinton and Trump. The majority of Americans hated both of them, okay? 60–65%. The outcome of the election, incredibly close. Trump wins the 3 states which he needed in the Electoral College by a total of 77,000 votes. It couldn't get closer. Clinton wins the popular vote by 2.8 million votes. All of those votes are in 5 counties, suburban counties of large metropolitan areas. So what swung the election was the middle part of the country turning Republican. And there you can see it, just visually. The countryside is red. Okay? All these counties, he won 700 or 800 counties which had been Democratic before, many of which had voted for Obama because Obama said, I'm standing for change, just as Trump did. Obama stood for change, but he couldn't bring change about for a variety of reasons. Okay? So that electorate turned conservative. The election is not a mandate for Donald Trump. That's why he was so upset that in his inaugural, he said, this was the largest inaugural population attendance ever in American history because I'm the greatest president of this great country. Well, it turned out to be a very sparsely attended inauguration. The demonstration against Trump 3 days later, 4 times as many people, 2.5 million people, compared to 750,000. So it's not a mandate for Trump, but it is a historic opportunity for the Republican Party because they're controlling the presidency in both houses of Congress, Senate and the House. That happens relatively rarely. Therefore, until 2018, this party will hang together as closely as it can to achieve its main legislative objectives. That's the one prediction one can make. There will be healthcare reform, tax reform, and what else they might want to do. And the one thing the Democrats want to do, they want to slow it down as much as possible because they think in 2018 they'll win the elections. Okay? So the counter-mobilization on the left now is something which is stronger, which is not covered by the press. You will not find this, but I can tell you first-hand observation. It's the strongest I've seen since the Vietnam War. That is, people who never were in politics or active dedicate half an hour to an hour a day to writing postcards, organizing, phoning their congressmen, going to meetings. And all that political energy will be channeled in 2018 on around 40 congressional districts, which are the swing districts. So there is a full politicization of American society going on, as it did after 2010, now from the left, after 2016. Okay. And here you see the posters, you know, Obama, where's your papers? That was a rallying cry. Obama is not an American citizen. This was called the birthday issue. I'll come back to it, you know. And he's not my president in this Washington. So the first thing about Trump for me is it's admirable, an admirable example of American democracy. At the same time, this political mobilization leads to institutional erosion. Our Supreme Court now is fully politicized. This is a very important change. If you think about the role of a politicized judiciary in Spain or in Latin America, we have it now. And the intelligence services are fully politicized. Liberals are rooting for the deep state. This is a politically perverse. Okay? Comey didn't, the FBI didn't choose to become political, but he was forced by the recklessness of Hillary Clinton. Okay? But we have a fully politicized intelligence community. And the Russian investigation is in part about Russia. It's in part about the politics of the intelligence service. Okay? Congress, in terms of public standing, is reviled. I mean, Americans think Congress is an institution. 8 to 10% will say it's legitimate. Okay? And the president is deeply polarizing, deliberately. He is a polarizing figure. He talks polarization, the way he draws boundary between us and them all the time. Okay? So our institutions are in deep trouble. And then there's the world of alternative facts. You want to find out about alternative facts, I always say, read Adolf Hitler on the big lie. Okay? Trump is killing the public sphere, not with a big lie, but with 1,000 little lies. And how we will rebuild that institutional part of American policy is not clear to me, because the next generation of politicians is going to learn the lesson. This will pay politically, because the communities are so fragmented now and split that they no longer share facts. Okay? On the average, Donald Trump lied 5 times per day in the first 100 days. Okay? Big lies, little lies, you know. When he plays golf, he doesn't lie. This was not a critical realignment, because the polarization persists. Critical realignments occur, and we're in the middle of one, but they occur in 1896 and 1932. Between 1968 and 80, when you got the shift away from the Democrats to Reaganism. And we are in the middle of a critical realignment of American politics since 2008. It will probably take another 2 election cycles before it's complete. Okay. But it is a fault line election. It signifies something pretty important. Neoliberalism as a policy dogma is dead. I think the financial crisis had a lot to do with it, but the politics of 2016 provide at the end. Multilateralism is at great risk, and unilateralism is clearly rising. Abroad, China and Russia were smiling at the election outcome because finally the human rights bug was off their back. Hillary Clinton would have bugged them about human rights. But I think they were smiling too early. So in China, if China cannot deliver on North Korea, and nobody knows what President Trump will mean by deliver, China will be in the hot seat. That is, the Chinese missile tests are progressing at a rate which is deeply, deeply disturbing to the American political establishment and American society. It's bipartisan. That is, if the North Koreans have a nuclear deliverable missile to the West Coast and Washington, we will fight war. We will fight a preemptive war. And that, given the tests which it has had, will happen within 2.5 years. So China has to somehow deliver North Korea, which is incredibly difficult to do. It's an incredibly difficult issue. We may want to talk afterwards. Okay? That's the primary issue. The currency, trade, all of those things are subordinate. And then, of course, Russia, I mean, the election meddling will provide fodder for stopping improvement between Russian and American relations for quite a while. Trump is not an American phenomenon. You find similar arrangements, political arrangements and election outcomes in Europe. It is a reorganization of politics away from left-right to the winners and the losers of globalization. And Europe is dealing with the same issues. Macron is a wonderful respite from this issue, but it will recur. And if Macron fails, it will become the issue for Europe. Okay? So, but I think Macron's election victory gives Europe another 2 or 3 years or 4 years to see whether, in fact, the state capacity which Europe has can be used to protect those who are losing out in globalization. Okay, so much for the setting. Now about sports. See, here's the Polish queen. Her name is Carly. She scored one of the greatest goals in the history of soccer from 55 yards off. If you haven't seen it, click on it, okay? It wasn't a fluke. She practiced that shot for years, okay? So she's a great athlete. But it's a metaphor for me to talk about power, very briefly, only 3 slides, because it helps you see what's specific about Trump. Here is the power we all know. All the books you read, all the papers you write, all the books you write, all the articles you read talk about power in one of those 4 dimensions. Material capabilities of strength, military, economic, whatever. Institutional settings, the rules. Structural conditions, that is a positionality. And persuasive power, or what people call soft power. This is the power we know. This is not how you capture Donald Trump. This is the power of American football. Here is the power to disrupt, which is what makes soccer such an interesting game. Fluid, innovative, improvisational, never caught in tactical maneuvers like timeouts with the coach talking by headphone to somebody else. Donald Trump is an American nationalist playing soccer. Never forget that he is a strategist of the unpredictable. This is not something which he sort of does 5 times a day without thinking. His career is based on this insight. And Hillary Clinton and the Democrats, and most journalists don't understand it. That's why you can do end runs around them. Okay? Here's one episode which I remember. New York Times once, there was a famous hotel in Manhattan, which I've forgotten now, right on Central Park West. Old hotel, wanted to be modernized, needed to be modernized. The unions made this impossible. He said, I can get this done. So he wants to buy it from some Japanese or American businessman, you know, and he's figured out how to do this. He says, I'm going to do this in less than half an hour. So he walks into the meeting with a bid which is about 30% higher than any reasonable commercial assessment. The guy is utterly stunned. They shake hands and that's it. Then he renovates it and sells it for another $200 million. Okay? It worked brilliantly. Why? Because he was disrupting the expectation of the real estate business, in this particular case, the pricing of that hotel, and the assumption that unions would block renovation. Okay. This is who he is as a politician. So he is not stupid. He may be uncouth and vulgar, but he is extremely smart. So the lecture then is about these two traditions of American conservatism, ethno-nationalism and religion and race. So briefly, American conservatism after 1945 was reactive. It was reactive to the New Deal. It was reactive to the Great Society of the 1960s. And it was reactive to multiculturalism after the 1980s. And Reaganism today is an intellectually spent force. There are no new ideas, okay? What are the new ideas? They're either populist progressive or they're traditionalist regressive. The two last candidates in the Republican primary, Donald Trump and Senator Cruz from Texas, were standing for those two visions of politics. Trump said, I'm a populist, and I will make America great again. I'll spend a lot of money doing it and whatever. Okay? Cruz said, I'm a traditionalist. I want to recreate the American state the way it was before 1896. Dismantle the American state of the 20th century. These are the two strategic visions which were clashing at the end of the Republican primary. If Trump were to fail in his vision, Cruz will be the one pushing the other. He is a supremely smart politician, by far the best politician in the Republican Party. Okay? And he is just ducking now and hiding and waiting. Okay? But he has a vision. But it will be a very different vision from the one which Donald Trump articulated. So the old ideas of the Reagan Revolution you see on the left, and many of them, of course, are part of the Trump program. But the new ideas which Trump brought during the campaign were big government, a big infrastructure bill, more spending on welfare for the poor, national welfare for all, xenophobia, appeal to racial prejudice, and misogyny. Okay? Those were the new ideas. So let me just focus on that first week, because abroad it wasn't clear why were the Americans so mobilized about the anti-immigrant executive order. This was strange. It looked strange. In America, we all knew that this was the decisive moment. If we didn't push then, we would lose. And Trump said, if I don't deliver on my xenophobia in the first week, I will lose. So the first week was enormously important for the Trump presidency. And the outcome of it was that Trump lost. What he did is he gave his the political advisors the right to write this executive order, not lawyers. And in doing so, they made a lot of legal mistakes. And that was then turned down by the courts, okay, where it's still sitting. But it was based on a political campaign which clearly appealed to racism. In the half-hearted rejection of the Ku Klux Klan, in the promotion of what was called the alt-right movement. Bannon, one of the major advisors of the president, was part of Breitbart, or running it, which was a marginal website, basically, right? But it's really white supremacists. And the deployment of racialist appeals to people who are not racists. I know quite a number of people among my friends, that is, people in Ithaca where I've lived my lifetime, they're not racists, not at all. But they are open to race-based appeals, and that is what drove the election. In particular, the birther issue, claiming that Obama was not an American citizen. This looked to liberals like a crazy idea. It resonated enormously deeply, and Trump held onto it for 3 years before he was forced during the campaign to renounce it. And then he says, of course, Hillary started it, one of his lies. Okay. So labeling Mexicans and illegal immigrants as rapists and murderers, which was his very first press conference, when he announces his candidacy, that is the main point of it. He descends in the Trump Tower on an elevator and gives a 12-minute address, and that's the bottom line. okay, and equating Islam with ISIS, which he didn't do in the first press conference, but very soon thereafter, and of course the birther issue. These were deliberately fashioned political messages to his base. So in the first week, this political move, this executive order was compared by the left to the Japanese internment of 1942 and the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1880. That is two dark chapters in American history. Whether that is right or wrong doesn't matter. It was hyperbole deployed for a political purpose. What was clear that it was religiously based discrimination, which is very un-American, okay? And it has been stopped in the courts. But what looked like a weird episode from abroad was enormously important for American society. Everybody knew that the basic fight was on this issue. And if Trump won it, he would win on a lot of other issues. And if he lost it, he would be stymied on a lot of issues. That's why that first week was so important. There was a lot of condemnation by American Christian churches, a lot of major European countries, and of course, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia were excluded from the. So ethno-nationalism, these are things which, when I came to the United States, struck me as somewhat odd, coming from a country, Germany, which had no nationalism after 1945. Pledge to the flag in the morning, every school kid, okay? The national anthem sung at all occasions. The political rhetoric of politicians, and of course, 4th of July, a great celebration, and the veterans of foreign wars. Okay? They are being shown and revered as the great Americans. This ethno-nationalism has close connections to religion and the Constitution. It is rooted in three traditions in American history: white Anglo-Saxon, and Scottish-Irish settlers, the frontier tradition, and the tradition you, of course, all know, which is the slave-owning South. But it's not the only one. There are two other ones. The white Anglo-Saxon core exists in the form of McCarthyism in the 1950s, a virulent anti-communist movement. It exists in the politics of the 1990s, which people have forgotten in the United States, nationalist, populist politics from the right, which did not succeed. Two in particular: Pat Buchanan, who ran for the presidency twice and was a talking head on TV for decades and still writes and is very articulate, and Ross Perot, who delivered the White House to Bill Clinton. That is, Ross Perot ran in 1992. He was a billionaire, just like Donald Trump, got rich by government contracts, basically, and he took 20% of the Republican vote. And without it, President Bush would have been reelected almost in a landslide. Okay. So we have, in very recent decades, last half century, versions of Trumpism. Okay. Trump is not unique. He represents this part of the Anglo-Saxon tradition. The second one is the frontier tradition. This is an iconic image of America moving west. Well, it seems pretty peaceful, right? There's some buffaloes. We eat a lot of buffaloes, right? But this turned out to be not so bloodless. Here's President Trump under his favorite picture, President Andrew Jackson. Trump is part of the Jacksonian tradition, which is that tradition of fundamentalist Protestantism, which basically exported ruthless warfare through the American continent, okay? And that meant basically exterminating the American Indians. So it was a genocidal conflict and white identity politics. And you will find in Jacksonianism an anti-elitist populism which says the real America is the heart of America. It's not on the coasts where the Democrats are. It's in the heart of America. That's the real America. It's nativist, it's anti-intellectual, it's anti-elitist, and it's anti-urban. And all of these attributes are deeply pervasive of the electoral base of Donald Trump, which is 40 to 45% of the American population today. I include Texas because Texas is so big and so large. Most foreigners think California is a really important state, and it is. But California is solidly liberal. Texas is solidly conservative. And it's always important to realize for every California in America, there is a Texas. And Texas is split. It was in part of the South, and it was in part of the Southwest. Okay? So it represents part of the Jacksonian tradition. And this will become much more important if Senator Cruz becomes more important in national politics. We will focus much more on Texas politics. The American West never experienced the threat of immigrants, of Indians or black slaves, and therefore is much more tolerant of diversity. So if you come from Asia, you like to live in Oregon or Washington State or California. It's a much more welcoming climate. And then finally, the third tradition is the white South. In terms of pure electoral politics, every Republican running for office will take the South as the basis of their political strategy. They'll have to carry the South. There you see how big and important Texas is, 38 votes, okay? And it's the greater South, including Oklahoma, Missouri, Kentucky, and West Virginia. It's really central for any political calculation. It is a conservative part of the country, economically very dynamic. It is not fascist. There has never been a genuine fascist movement in the South. But it does have authoritarian outbursts in moments of national fear. That characterizes the South. So that's one of the two traditions for Trump, ethno-nationalism, not civic nationalism. Often you're taught that liberal America believes in civic nationalism, which is true. It's one of two traditions, and the majority tradition in America is civic nationalism. Trump stands for this ethno-nationalist tradition, which I would call European nationalism. Okay? The second one is religion. It's hard for Europeans, not for Poles maybe, but in Western Europe and for the Japanese to understand how important religion is. America lives through its third religious revivalism now, since the beginning of the 19th century. And the iconic figure was Billy Graham, who makes mass religion, who institutionalizes mass religion. Some of these churches now accommodate 20, 30, 40,000 people in New Jersey, in a shopping mall, basically, right? So suburbanization and modernization re-infuse and reinvigorate religious communities. They do not eliminate it. That was the great conceit of the secularization thesis, okay? That modernization could only lead to the loss of religion. Not so in America. The Christian right, homogeneous, family-centered, it reinvigorates and perpetuates the Tocquevillian view of America as being defined by civic associations, which is really true. Much of America works not because of the state, which is pretty incompetent, but because of civic associationism. Strong tradition of volunteerism, organized often by and around churches. But it's also not just religious religion, it is also secular religion. America has a vibrant NGO sector. So you get meaningful communities, religious and otherwise, in which much of American politics occurs at the local level. And it's from the local level, from the grassroots, that these national movements get created. So many of these Christian right movements do enormously important social work. You can see it in Ithaca, I tell you. Deeply admirable. I admire that social work a whole lot more than professors who stand up and pontificate on the future of liberalism. They actually do the volunteer work in shelters and food kitchens, in things which the welfare state in America cannot deliver. Okay? And they coalesce into a formidable political force, the Christian right. After 9/11, it fuses with a pro-Israel, anti-Islam kind of sentiment, which was maybe diffused before. In Europe, this happens already after 1967. Didn't happen that strongly in America. But it's after 9/11, which was an attack on America, comparable only to Pearl Harbor in its massive psychological effect. Okay, this becomes an important part of American ideology. And now in recent times, I'd say in the last 10 or 15 years, a deep admiration for Christian Orthodox state churches. If you look at public opinion polls in support of Russia, A total flip. Russia used to be supported in the Soviet Union by the Democratic left and the Democratic Party. In the last year, a total collapse from 80 to 20%, while the Republican Party base is liking Russia, authoritarian Russia. Support runs about 60 to 70%. The first time in the 20th century. An enormous seismic shift driven by the polarization in American politics. Trump himself is not deeply religious, but he was unreservedly supporting the Christian right because it was an important electoral support. And in his cabinet choices, he was incredibly attentive to have the most prominent members of the Christian right appointed to his cabinet. The vice president, Jeff Sessions, who is doing the judiciary, Carson, DeVos and education, Pompeo and Price, environment. A lot of very prominent Christian right politicians are in the cabinet. For the Christian right, its strong streak of millenarianism. Before 2000, actually, they thought the world would come to an end, 2000. They were surprised it didn't, okay? The head of the EPA then said, let's burn all the trees now, it doesn't really matter, the world will end. I said that for 2 or 3 years before. And then we asked them afterwards, they said, well, I guess that was wrong, okay? So, a visceral hate, not dislike, hate of the United Nations, the European Union, as secular institutions encroaching on American sovereignty. It's inconceivable to Europeans how despised the EU is among the Christian right. And almost uniformly, the Christian right opposed Trump during the primaries. Okay? Where here was somebody who was profane, vulgar, 3 times married, owned strip clubs, but 80% support him as a president, vote for him, because they see him as the ticket for the kind of demands they have and expectations they have, particularly on abortion, on national politics. And here is race. Race is one of the great traditions of America, of that great country, and it's a bipartisan tradition. This is easy to forget. Race, of course, Teddy Roosevelt. He was a European imperialist. He was a great president. For example, the environmental movement wouldn't exist without Teddy Roosevelt, okay? And he was a profound racist, okay? The kind of racism which comes with talking about the civilized people and the uncivilized people, which was the doctrine of international law until the 1930s. Okay? So it's a European tradition, institutionalized in international law. He won't surprise you, but Woodrow Wilson as a liberal, as a racist, that will surprise many of you. Woodrow Wilson was president of Princeton. He was a man of the South, okay? Becomes president. And then the racism which you know about is that he vetoed the racial equality clause of the Treaty of Versailles, which is one of the reasons why Pearl Harbor exists. The Japanese never forgot it. Leave the League in 1934 and fight the war, not just because of the sanctions on the strategic oil embargo, because they said, this is not a glass ceiling against racism, this is a brick ceiling which American liberals created for us. We are not accepted as equals. Woodrow Wilson was the center of that. Okay? And it was utterly natural to him, given that he was from the South. Okay? He was a racist. Princeton University right now is going through all sorts of contortions about the Woodrow Wilson School. Should the name be abolished? Right? Many American universities go through this, and I hope it won't. I hope they'll endow a lecture series in which they will debate the racism of Woodrow Wilson for generations to come. Abolishing names means just silencing part of the tradition. Okay? Anyway, this is it's a bipartisan tradition, one of the great traditions of America. Not admirable, great in the sense of important. Okay? Now, since the mid-20th century, race has lost most of its valence. One of the important institutions which turns non-racist early on is the US Army, 1948. Never forget that the Army is one of the most progressive institutions on race. Not on gender, but on race, okay? And it's reflected in court rulings in the federal legislation of 1954 to the late 1960s, and a gradual shift in public attitudes. Politically, then comes the seismic shift the one which defines American politics ever since the late 60s. The Democrats lose the South and build a multicultural coalition, and the Republicans gain the South and criticize political correctness. Okay. Liberal internationalism abroad, Marshall Plan, NATO, all the good things which Europe experienced, was based on a pact with the devil. It was based on a pact of the devil, of the Northeast liberals in the Democratic Party with the segregationist South. And the segregationist South said, you can have your foreign policy if we can have institutionalized racism. Europeans are not aware of that, the pact of the devil. Things which worked out really well abroad for Europe didn't work out well for blacks in the South. Okay. So this is part of this bipartisan tradition. It's often overlooked. Okay. Republican internationalism after 1980 is based on religion. Okay. Some of the great forces of American politics are always there when you think about American engagement in the world. So the language of multiculturalism and political correctness is coded language. It is race-based appeal language. You can't call an American, African-American a nigger any longer. That's deeply offensive. Everybody understands it. But you can rail against political correctness. And everybody in America understands that it's a code word. Okay? So illegal voting is another of these code words. You know, if you look, you know, I tried to vote, that's an American, black American who couldn't vote. And the illegal voting issue, for which there is no scientific evidence, you know, that there are millions of people, Donald Trump. If the illegal voting didn't exist, he would have won the popular vote by 5 million votes or so. A commission now put up to study this issue, okay? It's, of course, a code word for saying, how do we disenfranchise part of the American electorate? And when I came to the United States in 1960, I said, this is the strangest country. They vote on Tuesdays. Why on earth would you vote on Tuesdays? And I'm asking my students this all the time, and they say, that's a really interesting question. Okay, I said, you vote on Tuesdays in order to keep the poor from voting. You Democrats and you Republicans together. That's the rule. And it never occurs to them. Nobody ever debates the rule of voting on Tuesdays. Right? Now with absentee, you can vote electronically. Absentee, it will become less important. But the Tuesday voting shows you that vote suppression is a bipartisan tradition. It's not just Republicans, also Democrats. So race and foreign policy, build the wall and have Mexico pay for it. And the Democrats will say, well, if you want to build a wall, get the Mexicans to pay for it. The Mexicans say, oh, we don't think we're going to pay for that, okay? So that's going to be a big issue in the next, symbolic, not political, symbolic for symbolic politics. And then, of course, ISIS as the existential threat. My students in my lecture halls think the existential threat for the United States is global warming. Okay. 2/3 of them liberals, 1/3 conservative. They all think environment is the existential threat. Okay. So, but for the Trump administration, it was pretty old. They see as ISIS the existential threat. I can see if you live in Manchester this morning, you might think ISIS is the existential threat. I have some sympathy for that. And the Europeans told the Bush administration, don't start that war because it will radicalize our Islamic citizens, which is exactly what happened. It isn't radicalizing Islamicists in America. They have hardly any left. And Arab Americans are fully integrated. So the fact that this is the existential threat is probably serving other political needs. But in any case, this is part of the foreign policy. You can see the visit to Saudi Arabia as being part of this. So what about realism versus Trumpism? You know, Trumpism is a foreign policy doctrine. I'd say it's like a rationalist economic model. Interests exist, but in a shallow value framework. Realists, on the other hand, think that interests are embedded in a deep value framework. They both look alike if you look at the newspapers of the day because there's tactical maneuvering for advantage. But they do differ very substantially in how they look at the world. And here's a summary of how they look at the world. Neoconservatism was very important in the first decade of this century. It's forward-looking, outward, and optimistic. Something marks Trumpism is it's his pessimism. It's a very dark view of the world and of America. Okay? Great deeds abroad for the neoconservatives. Trump wants to renew America, which he shares with many Democrats. Okay? Virtue is not a noun in Trump's vocabulary. Winning is, not virtue. Regime change? No. Transactional bargains. The Mideast, what he's doing now, he says it's going to be the greatest deal of all. Okay? If he can pull it off, it will be the greatest deal of all. Okay? So it's bargaining. And there is a form of democratic realism about them in which you calculate your national security interests. And I think he has a broad conception of national security which encompasses economic issues, which I think is the correct way of thinking about it. While the neoconservatives thought very much about democratic globalism, spreading democracy. He's not interested in spreading democracy. He likes, in fact, people like himself who are temperamentally inclined to be authoritarian. Temperamentally, I think, shaped by his business career. He's not, I don't know whether he's authoritarian or not in his family life or whatever, but as a businessman, you can say, you do this or I fire you. You're fired in his TV, right? So he's been shaped by this thing, I have total control. And he's very surprised and stunned and upset that Washington doesn't work that way. National greatness, I say it's improvised. Unprincipled, I don't mean critically here. Unprincipled in the sense of pragmatic, okay? And it will be bargains which will come together and he will sell them. He is an incredible salesman. That is what he's famous for. He built stuff in his early career, went bankrupt 6 times, used the tax code in order to get rid of the debts. Since then, all he has done is brand, sell the brand. And one of his greatest surprises, or greatest successes, is his cap, which is made in China. Okay? Most of his accessory is made in China. And he rails against China, and his base just buys it all, okay? Because he's such a successful salesman. So The Art of the Deal is a book, and then in the middle carrier, this was, taking credit for jobs, which some company in the Midwest was not going to cut, okay? He will do a great job at selling the successes. Let me conclude then with one of the great movies about America. So for the students here, when you've written your finals, this is one to get from Netflix or Amazon, okay? The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. It's a spaghetti western about the Vietnam War. And like if I'd say, give you a book, I'd say The Quiet American would be the other thing to read. You want 2 things about America, you know nothing except this lecture. The Quiet American, Graham Greene's novel, 150 pages. It's a great read, an hour and a half. And you learn an unbelievable amount about America, okay? And then this one on Netflix, okay? So here are these 3 guys. They want the Union bankroll, and they're 3 characters, right? And the good one, the bad one, and the Max American, okay? So the good one, the good America, the reluctant superpower. Greatness not sought, but it's thrust upon an unwilling United States by a world events, okay? And here you get the list, World War I was really Germans forced America. World War II, well, really Japan forced America. The Cold War, well, we got engaged as the United States in order to protect all these little countries in Europe, right? And certain kinds of principles. This is what I would call the civics self-understanding of America. This is probably, I'd say, 3/4, 4/5 of American self-understanding is this conventional view, okay? Then there's the other one, the bad America, limitless expansion. Very much associated with Charles Beard, who was a best-selling Columbia historian in the first half of the 20th century. He sold millions of copies. That is, he was a historian working in the tradition of American progressivism, okay? And lost his standing only when he attacked FDR in the 1930s, saying that FDR was looking for reasons to enter World War II. He was an isolationist, okay? And he had a very compelling story from the beginning of the Republic to the end, which you would just call semi-Marxist or neo-Marxist, okay? And then there was a second historian, William Appleton Williams, what's called the Wisconsin School of History, from the 1950s on to cover the Cold War, okay? And a beloved friend and a colleague, Walter Fieber at Cornell, belongs to that school. His textbook, 12 editions, very important for college education. So limitless expansion. So for Beard, it starts with the economic origins of the Constitution, goes to the origin of the Cold War. That is, the Cold War is a contraption by American capitalism forcing the Soviet Union, okay? But it's now extended to cover neoliberalism and the Washington Consensus from the mid-1980s on until now. So that is the second tradition of America. And the third tradition of America, political realism. It isn't really an American tradition. It is a European import. It's un-American. So the most famous debate about this is between Henry Kissinger, a European emigre who writes his dissertation at Harvard on the topic is A World Restored, 1815, and the great hero is Count Metternich, the guy who organized the peace conference and pulls all the strings and brings order to the world, okay? And Paul Wolfowitz, a neoconservative defense intellectual, moving force behind the wars of the 2000s, but an incredibly brilliant and intelligent strategist. I mean, he started in the 1970s, right? And he and Cheney and Rumsfeld are bent on pushing Kissinger out of office, and they succeed. Why? Because the great hero in that book, A World Restored for Paul Wolfowitz, is not Metternich, it's the Tsar, who is a true reactionary. True in the sense he stands for his values. Metternich is one of these shifty diplomats, right? So this realism part is un-American for Wolfowitz. It turns out that realism has made a comeback in the last 40 years, both among conservatives and liberals. They call it different things, but realism is there now in American society much more than in the first half of the Cold War. Okay. Populists like Trump couldn't care for either form of realism since they want to make deals. But in the sense that they pursue short-term interests, of course, they are realists as well. So the good, the bad, and the ugly are all part of the United States. It's our three traditions. We have been a mixture of wisdom, brutality, and greed, and short-term interests. And what I take from the movie is it's not a good idea to think about binaries when you think about politics, about black and white, or good and bad, or internationalism or isolationism. It's too, thinking binaries may be better than thinking about essentialized unity. The Americans, the Russians, the Poles, the Germans, okay? But in politics, in fact, the gift of politicians, and the great ones are great artists, are to take these different strands, to reweave them into something new, so that they get new political legitimacy, new support for the purposes of the day. Trumpism. Trumpism is the Max American. I like this slide, okay? It's mostly ugly, short interests. Probably quite a lot of bad, but perhaps also some good. So President Trump and the importance of leadership. The optimists in America think that Trump will be like Berlusconi, a media mogul, okay? And Berlusconi cost Italy 15 years. At most, Trump will cost us 8 years, okay? The pessimists think that Trump will become a Mussolini. I think the pessimists don't think that Trump is Mussolini, but the pessimists think if there were a major attack during his presidency, his authoritarianism would carry through the institutions which are no longer fully resilient. Okay. As for now, I think we're all realists. We only see Trump, the narcissist. He really has no core, no inner beliefs. He channels information and emotions of others. He's deceptive. He lacks empathy to a stunning degree. He uses battering for control. He engages in conspiracy theories. He's enormously self-centered. He knows no remorse, and he's full of entitlements. He is legitimate. He's our president. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Katzenstein, for this marvelous lecture. I don't know, deconstructing or constructing American foreign policy at the age of Donald Trump. This lecture also not only brought us the new ideas, but a lot of issues that we tend to forget or neglect in analyzing US foreign policy, to a large extent looking at this realist dimension. 1 year and a half we had Professor Meschheimer here, so I would be really happy to hear your debate on this issue again. Or I had the pleasure to hear it sometimes. If it was constructing of American foreign policy, I'm pretty sure it will be really influential, even though as a university professor, as you said, you can only afford for one bottle of wine, but you at the same time are one of the 10 most influential IR scholars. So I do hope not only those ideas presented in the lecture, but also what we will hear when you will answer to the questions of our audience, both scholars and students that are here, will be influential. So let me open the floor for a short Q&A session, and I think we'll collect up to 5 questions in the first round, and then we'll hear the answers. So, well, there is, okay, let's start with Giovanni. But short question, Giovanni, please. You can show it.
Loud enough. Okay. Thank you for the very interesting, wonderful, multi-layered and not black and white analysis of Trump phenomena. And also for this tribute to international Italian theory, because this Bad and the Ugly is an Italian movie, as you know very well. So, but I have one little criticism, about the analysis, because at the end, your view of Trump is still, the support for Trump, in your view, is still ethno-nationalist based, right? So, isn't it also, there is this globalization reason? It seems that all the supporters of Trump, although new from your analysis, are kind of white racists, but not only, but there is this deep culture of whiteness and so on. But what about the so-called stereotyped winners and losers of globalization? Like you said also, isn't it that a lot of leftists, in a way, also maybe voted Trump, maybe from the poor class? More in a Marxist point of view approach. And second question about the very, shocking for me talk by Trump yesterday in Saudi Arabia, because you underlined his anti-ISIS, anti-Islamic approach in the election, and we know that he is a liar, so he can change opinion, but don't you think that he was in a way very underplaying the Sunni terrorism in the world, going straight against Iran and the Shia terrorism? So, this view of his attack to Islamic ISIS terrorists, isn't it old-fashioned now, because he's now going through the Shia, Iran, Syria terrorism? So thanks.
Okay, thank you. There was a question here, so actually both of you, just short, and then we go to Wojtek.
My name is Karol Schulz. I'm from University of Wrocław, which you may know as Breslau. A very short question, because it's really hard to believe, I guess, for us that Donald Trump is smart as we watch American media, most of us probably the shows. So I would just like you to ask you to analyze a little bit what is happening right now. Week after week we face even bigger crisis, and it's really too hard to believe that he controls anything what he's doing. And the picture that we get is that he's just a big spoiled child. And could you comment on that? Thank you.
Okay, Adam? There was...
Oh, sorry.
Here?
Thank you. My name is Adam Krzykowski. I'm from Jagiellonian University here in Krakow. Mr. Professor, I appreciate your remark concerning the ability of Trump to achieve his objectives by disrupting the expectations. I mean, heard your story about this deal on the hotel by Central Park West. It shows us how Trump behaved as a businessman, how he won by sometimes irrational offers he simply could afford. However, politics, including international politics, has its own rules, which are slightly different than real estate business. So my first question is, to what extent, in your opinion, is Trump able to control the outcome of his unexpected political decisions? And the second question is, does Russia could in any way benefit from this breeding uncertainty? Thank you.
Thank you.
I think I'll take those two questions.
Okay.
So, yes, the economic base is very important. That's why I lived in upstate New York and was not surprised. Okay. What turns out to be really important now is figuring out what does the evidence suggest about the relative priority of one, let's call it broadly cultural, and the other, let's call it broadly economic issues. And there the evidence I've seen so far is utterly unconclusive. And probably with all big events, it will remain unconclusive, which is bad news for the Democrats, because they need to fashion an electorate. Right? So my sense is that the Democrats will say, maybe you ought to talk a little less about transgendered bathrooms and a little bit more about jobs and the opioid crisis or something, right? But the evidence, the micro-level evidence doesn't clearly say, oh, it's one or the other. But it's clear that the election was won in that red map in the middle, right? The industrial heartland, which has been wiped out. And my worry about American politics is actually not about now. It's what happens 8 years from now when deindustrialization has continued, the gap has broadened, Obama didn't work out, Trump didn't work out, some successor to Trump didn't work out. What are these people going to do? Because the state capacity of the American state to turn the wheel, to provide for the generation which is losing through globalization some decent form of life, doesn't exist. So if there is a structural worry for me about American democracy, it's not now. It's 8 to 12 years from now. There's always good news and the bad news. 8, 12 years from now, I may not be around any longer. But this is what I would say about American democracy. Is Trump out of control? I think Trump is out of control when he tweets all the time. I literally think he is out of control. He acts on the impulse of the moment. And the impulse of the moment is often media-driven. He's never read a book, right? He doesn't read. So people now who want to get to the president know that they have to get onto the talk shows or their view onto the talk shows when they think the president is watching. They know what the schedule is because he doesn't take new information from his advisors, particularly negative views, okay? So I think, yes, in some ways he's out of control, but if you're saying he's out of control politically, I don't think so. Creating havoc is a strategy. So would he have liked Comey not to start the Russian investigation? For sure. Can he live with the investigation? For sure. No problem. Clinton lived with that investigation in the 1990s for 3 years, right? So in fact, it takes pressure off him. So I agree that the last 2 weeks were a little hard to take because the news cycle normally, you had 2 events per hour, particularly between 4 and 6 p.m., okay? Because the leaks are stunning. I fully understand the president says, the FBI ought to go after the leaks, which is to say the government is fully politicized, right? There's nothing which he can keep in, right? But controlling outcomes is not how he made his career. So I don't think he feels particularly, he says, this is the kind of world in which I maneuver pretty well, right? Business is different from politics, for sure, and he's learning that, and he gave a fairly reflective, self-reflective interview at the end of his first 100 days and said, wow, this is a much heavier lift than I expected it to be, you know, and that is to say, this, you know, he said, oh my God, you know, the first government department is bigger than any company, the second one is bigger than any company, the third one's any company. I didn't know any of this, you know. Well, healthcare, whoa, this is really difficult, right? Because he never focused on policy. I mean, he literally, the level of his ignorance is stunning, okay? So he doesn't care about policy, okay? And now that he's sitting through these meetings, you know, he says, he has an attention deficit. He can't sit through meetings which are longer than 5 to 10 minutes, right? So you have to condense all of it. You can't condense it into an abstract of half a page. That's too much, right? So it's a great challenge for advisors to brief the president, right? So yes, he's learning that. At the same time, he is a man who walked around the streets of New York with $800 million on his back, okay? And telling his kids, I'm not sure I'm going to get out of it. And he did get out of it, okay? Clever maneuvering, smart, brash, selling things, you know. I mean, when he builds his casinos, he has no money. What does he do? He hires some people who have bulldozers, right? And he says, go dig holes and then fill them right up again. And brings the investors in and says, look at all these bulldozers, I'm really building this big casino, you know. And one of them says, yeah, but they're filling up the holes with sand. He says, don't look at that, you know. That's how he raised his money. He has done incredibly well in the real estate business, and he's a man full of himself. So I think he thinks he is the greatest president. So yes, the world is not as easy, but so far I don't see, I mean, it's very early on, and he's of course learning, right? So far I see no reason to believe that he says he couldn't succeed, right? Russia. So I think, you know, I have no information, okay? So I have just an intuition. My intuition is that he had a lot of Russian billionaires invest in a lot of Trump apartments. They were diversifying their portfolio, right? So he knew quite a lot of these characters. And therefore, he had done deals with them, right? And he thought he could do deals with Russia. And in particular, a deal about Syria, which we all want a deal on Syria, right? His campaign, however, was staffed with people who had taken money from the Russians and maybe done other things. I mean, I don't know, right? So my hunch is that this investigation will turn up evidence of people, not big-time corruption. I'm talking Flynn taking $40,000 to give a speech. That's small corruption. I don't think that's corruption even. If the Russians are stupid enough to pay him $40,000, let them do it. What was stupid on Flynn's part, the guy who just took the Fifth Amendment, was not to say, I took $40,000 from the Russians. People were saying, good for you, right? It's the lying part, right? So the leader of the campaign had to resign. I'm sure he's deeply implicated in Ukrainian politics, right, through money. But I don't expect that Donald Trump committed treason like the Democratic left does. Or I just expect general sleaze. That's what defines this White House. You know, I mean, everybody's making money. His daughter's making money, his wife is making money, he's making money, right? That's just the way they look at the office, right? So if I said, well, what's the nature of our democracy? I think our ship of state is sailing south. We are becoming a Latin American democracy with a politicized judiciary, with a presidency which doesn't observe the norms of American politics. And whether we can steer the ship of state back north remains to be seen. We will be a democracy, there's no question in my mind. And I don't think the military is going to intervene in politics. But we may be seeing a change in which sleaze becomes a generic part of American politics. It has always been in American politics. You go to the state of Illinois, every last governor over the last decade is sitting in jail, deeply corrupt, right? But at the national level, that really hasn't happened since Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson, you know, had no money, and he has an enormous amount of assets when he leaves the presidency. That was good old-fashioned machine politics, right? But since then, that hasn't really happened. So we are going back to that. You know.
Okay, there was a question here.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Rafał Wiśniewski. I'm from the Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań. And I wanted to go back to your remarks about how Trump killed the traditional Republican Party, and they are in disarray. But what is your opinion on whether at least parts of this party or the more classical, if we could call them Republicans, are having a bigger influence on his administration? So you've mentioned that part of new thinking that Trump exhibits is like big government. But today, his administration has submitted a budget which actually increases defense spending and slashes Medicaid and other programs. And also like the shift in Syria policy, like the attack on the Shariat airbase. Do you think that was more a one-off, short-termist Trump wanting to show his electorate that he's a tough leader, or maybe people like Mattis and McMaster were able to influence his foreign policy to be more to their liking? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rafał. Karina?
Hi, Professor Katzenstein. I'm here from New York as well, from Brooklyn. My question has to do with the left. You mentioned that the left is deeply divided. I have the same observation. And you mentioned what happens next, neoliberalism is dead. What happens when Obama didn't work out, when Trump didn't work out? What about the new recent poll with Bernie Sanders being the most highest favorable ratings of all American politicians? Do we have any chance of turning towards a Sanders style of politics within the left?
Okay, thank you. Good.
Thank you very much for your lecture. And my question refers to Saudi Arabia, given the recent trip by President Trump. Because in your book, The World of Regions, you wrote that the world is organized into regions around the American Imperium. So my question is if Saudi Arabia could be such a place in the Middle East. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, and maybe we'll manage to collect one more. So, Magda?
Thank you very much.
Okay, two more if it's possible. One.
Thank you very much, Professor,
okay,
for your interesting lecture. My name is Magdalena Lisińska. I'm from the Jagiellonian University. I'd like to ask you about the role of gender in American politics in general, because we all know the, let's say, inappropriate comments of Donald Trump about women during the campaign and the leaks that appeared. But when we see the results of the election, we know that the division between women and men voting for Trump were like average, like in the same election in terms of Democratic and Republican candidates. So if you could please comment on this issue. Thank you.
Now hold on, I'm going to, otherwise my head just starts spinning too much. So the Republican parties, where was that question? The wings of the Republican Party. So it's extreme, I think it's a very perceptive question. You think about the history of the Republican Party. It was taken over in the 1980s by the Texas Party. There's the liberal wing northeast. They were called golf course Republicans. Which was part of Dallas. They were pushed aside, and Houston took over, which was oil. Okay, and you can now see in the Republican Party, there are very few golf course Republicans left. And it's a lot to do with the way our gerrymandered system makes it, the general election is not important, it's all about the primaries, right? So if you're a moderate Republican, it's very hard getting your seat, right? So you have versions of Trumpism now, people saying that might win, or versions of Cruz, right? So those are the competing wings. The budget, it's true, this is Trump's budget. But It's a budget outline, it's not spelled out. But you're characterizing it correctly. You take from the poor and give to the rich, which turns out to be based on the doctrine of economic trickle-down, which is why I called Reaganism intellectually dead. I think Trump has decided, to my great surprise, not to become a populist. So he has now, with the budget and the healthcare, thrown his hat with the conservative, Reaganist Republican Party. My expectation had been with Bannon that he would start with the infrastructure bill, split the Democratic Party, and then face down the hardline right in the Republican Party on healthcare, and thereby split the Democratic Party. This Democratic Party will no longer be split. It's going to hang together until 2018. Okay? And why he didn't choose to do that, I don't know. We'll have to wait and see what was there. It might be simply that it was the politics of the moment, or that he lacked Bannon's strategic vision. Bannon, I think, has a strategic vision about American politics. Trump doesn't. Right? Syria, the attack, if you look carefully at why he attacked, it was because, you know, some family members said, you ought to see, these are horrible pictures. He was overwhelmed by how horrible they were, and said, this cannot stand, and I will bomb. In that process, I am pretty sure that advisors said, this is a good thing to do for two reasons. One is, it sends a signal to the Russians. We are back, okay? Trump has no interest in fighting in Syria, okay? And it will be generating bipartisan support in America. When America bombs, Americans clap, okay? Obama, when he said, you do this, that's a red line, I will come and bomb you, and then didn't do it, in the long interview in the Atlantic Monthly, he says that he's most proud of that decision because he withstood the pressure of that bipartisan thing. Okay? I think he was wrong, but that he regards as the high point of his foreign policy, in withstanding the pressure to bomb. Okay? So I think there was these elements together. I don't think this is signaling anything about the Syrian policy for the American government. Right? So Sanders is older than I am, so he cannot be the future, okay? But it is true that the Sanders wing of the Democratic Party, right, is there, and economic populism is an enormously powerful force, which is fighting with that other part of the Democratic Party. Right now, these are the two wings. You can't see it, but they're really at odds with each other. So the one possible candidate for 2020 is Joe Biden, old as he is, because I don't see anybody else building up a national constituency. And Biden might be the one, he has a working class background, he sort of talks folksy, right? Might be one to paper over that split, right? But I agree with you that the party will not survive the split. That is, economic populists have a view of politics which doesn't sit well with the, let's call the independent professionals. And the elections are always won by independents, so if the economic populists take over, they might win against a very unattractive candidate on the Republican right. But I think it'll be very hard for them to build a winning coalition, right? But it's too early to tell. So yes, this is a very viable force because economic populism is the way to regain the Midwest, right? Whether you can in fact deliver policy and improved lives to the Midwest under either Trumpism or economic populism remains to be seen. Right? Saudi Arabia. So it is true that Trump has discovered what Sam Huntington never did, that there's more than one Islam. If you look at Huntington's Clash of Civilization, those maps, it's only green for Islam, right? That is how Trump was talking during his campaign. And then he appointed the military and some other people to run the foreign policy machinery and said, listen, that's not quite true. There are two Islams. And he's learned that, okay? So that's why I refer to the learning effect. So yes, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states are part of the Mideast, but if you think about the trip he's taking right now to the two closest allies, Saudi Arabia and Israel, Well, they couldn't be further apart. Saudi Arabia is the remaining feudal system in the world, right? And it's waging jihad against America. I mean, that's what it is. You can't... Saudi Arabia is split between the mosque and the House of Saud. The mosque is waging war against us. We all know this, okay? So 9/11 was, after all, Saudi citizens. And the Saudis have, by the reckoning of the Saudi police, exported 7,000 jihadists to the world in the last 20 years. Nobody can be unknown. These are not close allies. The other part of Saudi Arabia is a close ally. But the House of Saud has to fund the mosque, which then exports through education to Pakistan and other failing states, jihadism, right? So this makes the world really complicated. That's Saudi Arabia, part of the Middle East. Then there is Israel. But Israel is in part in the Middle East, but it's really the 51st state of the United States. It's deeply part of American domestic politics. Traditionally, it was always said, you want to run for the president? You can't give up Florida and New York State and California. They're too important for money and electoral votes, which means you had to satisfy the demands of the Jewish vote, right? Still true for Florida, no longer true for New York and California, because they're so one-party dominant, right? So Israel and Netanyahu made it part of American domestic politics. Netanyahu's conflict with Obama split the American Jewish community. And you will see now in the next 20 years that the domestic base of American foreign policy will be reshaped by a Jewish community which will be accommodationist and one which will be hardline. And we will be drawn in to the Mideast conflict if Trump does not succeed in ways which will be deeply, deeply tragic for us. Okay? So Israel is not just in that region, it's in the core of American politics. And that has happened over a longer term since 1967, basically, okay? And with great, great consequence for us. Mearsheimer and Wald's book, flawed as it is in many ways, points to the divergence of the national interest of Israel and the United States. Israel is, in its present situation, heading towards an apartheid state. American democracy can't tolerate apartheid. So if Israeli Arabs were ever to move into national politics in a way of organized civil disobedience, it would put American diplomacy in an impossible situation. Right? So Israel is a great worry. Okay? Both of them in the region, both of them deeply problematic, both of them very different, since you read the book, from Japan and Germany, which are pivots of support in East Asia and Western Europe, which is why the Middle East has not lent itself to American diplomacy. Right. Okay, and then the issue of gender. So I think from the reports, lots of people are asking, there was a large gender gap at first in the election, and then it narrowed down. And in talking, journalists then went and talked to a lot of people. And I read those articles. I haven't read the specialized literature. American women were able to put the gender issue together with other issues. And on balance, that is the Trump coalition, is based on women who are saying, what's happening to our husbands and our children is more important than the misogyny of the candidate. Okay? The demonstration in Washington was run by the women's movement. I don't know whether you know the pussy hat, all these pink little caps, right? My wife just made a pussy hat for my granddaughter, for my grandson, okay? So was born 2 months ago. It's become a symbol, right? But I think the women were saying there are a number of important issues affecting family, and not just women, and they were able to subordinate this. Women in the cities, liberal, professional, no. Right? So you get then an evening out of the gender difference in the course of the campaign, and now it's 55-45 or something. At the high point of the campaign, it was 65-35 or something, right? So I think it's showing you, I think it's a reflection of the crisis conditions of families in many parts of the country.
I'm not sure whether we can still take two more. Okay, so let's go here. And then maybe to the back.
So, Professor, thank you for your time. I have the following question. I would like to... Pardon? I hope you enjoy it. I wanted to link President Trump with American exceptionalism, namely with the fact that the idea of American exceptionalism is often credited for taking the U.S. overseas, as we see in case of Wilsonian idealism. This rhetoric actually echoes a lot in post-World War II and after Cold War years in George Bush Sr., Bill Clinton, and George Bush, as well as the Obama administrations, who underlined this mission of American people to transform the world. And I was wondering if Trump somehow has corrupted this rhetoric or has betrayed the American ideas of American exceptionalism. If yes, how? I would like to know. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so just two more.
Thank you for your lecture. My question would be China related. So in the likely scenario of US-China rapprochement under the President Trump, how would these dynamics affect the US response to the Chinese actions in the South China Sea? Would the State Department simply turn a blind eye at the buildup of the artificial islands? So just elaborate on that issue, please. Thank you.
And the last one will...
Thank you, Professor, for this very interesting and insightful lecture. Recently in Germany, Angela Merkel was widely praised for being so shrewd as to invite Ivanka Trump to an international conference. And it was a strategy to get through Ivanka to get to Trump. She's thought to be a more coherent person. What do you think about Trump and nepotism? Is he trying to create a new dynasty? And what role is his family going to play in politics, in particular in international politics? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Unfortunately, this was the last question for Q&A, I guess. Oh. Okay.
Thank you so much. Sahashik Irina, Jagiellonian University. I would like to continue a topic about Israel. Just happened to visit to this country. And my question is, what changes we may expect from United States and Israel relations, and how it will influence on the situation in Syria? Maybe we should expect establishing a new country like a Kurdistan. What do you think? Establishing a new country in a territory of Syria, Kurdistan? That's my question. Thank you.
The city on the shining hill, or is it the shining city on the hill, right? The city on the shining hill. I think this is deeply bred into America. No president can take, because religion, we are, I mean, this is 1680, right? We are infused by this religious sense of self, okay? And it has a missionary zeal. And The Silent American, the book which I mentioned, shows you the unbelievable naivete which comes from a very young country, which is so doctrinaire, okay? So I don't like American exceptionalism as a category, because as a scholar, I don't think anything is exceptional. Every country I go to, they always say, we are really very exceptional. And I say, no, you're distinctive. There's some things that are really very particular, and some things that are really very common. Chinese in particular think they're really singular. I say, no, nothing specific about China. You're just big and important, like India and the United States, and you have distinctive features, which you call having a Chinese face, which seems all right. So I think when Trump says, let's make America great again, this is what he means, right? Great not just in that we have third world, which is of course wrong. Third world airports are a whole lot better than first world airports. But nothing works in the infrastructure. He says, I'm a builder, I want roads, without potholes. You know, you're driving on the interstate here in Poland, except for the one stretch, you know, much better than any roads we drive on, right? He says, that make America great again. At first he thinks about that. But I think it's part of thinking about the American uniqueness, right? The American model. But he doesn't want to take that model on the road. He doesn't say, oh, therefore you have to all become like us. I don't think so. He says, you've got to make deals with us, right? Deals which I, Donald Trump, think are fair, right? So I think the greatness theme, I assume, if he succeeds politically, will evolve to encompass that tradition. It just seems too, for me, it seems too much a part of our DNA, okay? China, the South China Sea. So it is true that you could think about China and the United States in the South China Sea. But what if you took the United States apart and said, I want to look at the United States, the executive branch of government, and the other great institution, the US Navy. You know, if you go to the Pentagon and you look at the furniture which the Army has and the Air Force and the US Navy, you get a very clear sense that that is an institution made for the ages. Big desks are made out of oak, you know, and they've been there for 100 years, and they will be for another 100 years. The Air Force, it's sort of tinny, 1950s furniture. The Army, it's file cabinets from the 1930s, okay? You would never find that in the US Navy. US Navy is an institution which has an enormous amount of clout and projective power, okay? So the US Navy will not settle for an interference with mare librum, right? Freedom of the sea. But it's very attentive to the deterrent power which China is building. The US Navy is being pushed out of the littoral, Chinese littoral now, by basically defensive weapons, right? Missile technology. So this will become a cat and mouse game of two great navies. But the Japanese and US Navy have enormous power in the South China Sea. So I expect, you know, that you will get not a dog with a tail running away, but a cat and mouse game. Okay. And of course, for the US to be able to embed that issue in a larger set of issues is a strategic advantage. Just as the Chinese leadership uses that issue for nationalist purposes, but it's not that important. After all, the South China Sea issue was generated not by China, it was generated by Japan. The waters of South China Sea, under customary law, were under Japanese rule. And when the Japanese right says we want to politicize the issue and forces the left, then in power in Japan, to buy the island, that's when the Chinese said we got to do something, because now customary law is being accelerated to our disadvantage. So the provocation came from Japan, not from China. China is the reactive force. But then, of course, in China itself, the military and the Coast Guard and Chinese international law, which is actually national law, Isaac Carden, a student of mine, just finished a dissertation on this, right, interact and generate their own power dynamics, which is not the same as the one of the president, right? So I think it's going to be an issue which will not go away, but I don't think that it's necessarily an issue which will lead to war in the foreseeable future. Okay. Merkel. Yeah, I think Merkel is a good student of Trump, but Trudeau was a much better student. The Canadian Prime Minister, he'd figured this out right away. And every foreign leader said, oh, that's a really smart foreign minister, Prime Minister, and he was. So yes, you do use the structure of 18th century court politics to understand the dynamics of his administration. It's true that any president brings into his close set of advisors their particular mafia. And the mafia is normally territorially defined. Southern California for Ronald Reagan, Midwest Chicago, and a little bit of East Coast for Obama, okay? Georgia and the South for Carter. This is because you need people around you who you can trust. And sometimes they're family members. Bobby Kennedy was an enormously important member of the cabinet. And at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, more important than anybody else. Okay. So this tradition in American politics is not unique. Trump is using it, because with Kushner and his daughter, he has two people he really trusts, and especially Jared Kushner is a very smart man. Okay. And will this extend to a broader tribe of politicians? I doubt it. I mean, I take it that the Polish prime minister is single, and that sort of constrains him compared to the Hungarian prime minister, who has a large family. I don't expect Hungarian-style politics to pervade American politics. But I do think that Trump, for example, has about 12 people he talks to on phone regularly. They're mostly business affiliates. He doesn't really like his Washington advisors, okay? And he very closely listens to his family members. So yes, it is family politics of a kind, which if you study dynastic politics, is not unusual. But I don't think it's so unusual in America. Right? And finally, Israel and Syria. So learning about two kinds of Islam makes suddenly, and going to Saudi Arabia and saying Iran is the great threat, which I think Donald Trump believes, okay, makes the situation for Israel much more complicated. So Netanyahu may have had a problem with Obama. If Trump is serious about this, he will have an even bigger problem with Trump. Because Netanyahu's domestic base is very limited. His cabinet didn't want to go to the airport, in part because they said there is no time to shake the hand of the president, in part because the right wing says we got to stand up to this guy. Okay. So I think Israeli-American relations will be problematic under Trump, whatever. Because I think it's built into the dynamics of Israeli domestic politics to say the status quo is acceptable. The one-state solution is dead. The two-state solution, we don't know. The status quo is what we can live with, okay? Including, of course, more settlements, right? And this may not be, if Trump says, I'm thinking big, and I will do this, this may not wash with him. It's safe to say that all this rhetoric will be toned down. And where people for 40 years have failed, Donald Trump will also fail. But I've now talked to people who are saying this is the best chance we've had in decades. I'm not sure how far they will go back, but certainly the last 30 years, that something might happen. But it would break Netanyahu's political career. Now, he may be indicted within 2 months, in which case his career would be over anyhow, right? But it will have would have great implications for Israeli domestic politics. And what would come out of that, we wouldn't know, right? Would Syria be divided up? The no-fly zones might become the safe zones, might become proto-states? It's possible. Right now, everybody says we've got to stop the bloodshed. Right? Thank you.